So getting through this horrible period, the last thing this economy can withstand is this multi-trillion-dollar tax increase. And so our letter essentially says, let's do the right thing for America. Let's do the right thing for hardworking taxpayers all across the country and make these tax cuts permanent.
Remember those tax cuts that Donald Trump passed? Well, Joe Biden is threatening to let those cuts expire. Can we really stand 4 more years of this? Joining us now to discuss is the anti-tax man, Jonathan Williams from the American Legislative Exchange Council, joining us live right now. Good morning, Jonathan. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, and greetings from the land of make-believe out here in Washington, D.C.
What is Joe Biden threatening to do to us all, Jonathan?
Well, he's certainly threatening to double down on that moniker of land of make-believe because, as you know, Austin, the Trump tax cuts, 2017, those momentous, first in a generation since Reagan, really, remake of the federal tax code under these complicated U.S. Senate rules are slated to go away by the end of next year if nothing is done. And Joe Biden has signaled just that despite his pledge to not raise taxes on anybody making under 400,000, right? I mean, that's kind of a laugh line these days. He is going straight ahead to say absolutely not. He would not allow those Trump tax cuts to continue if he is reelected. And so, what does that look like? That's something for all of us, Austin. It's every single one of those individual provisions of those Trump tax cuts. Now, a lot of the corporate side tax cuts, those were made permanent in the law. The little wrinkle there is those child care tax credits, the lower rates, the small business treatment, so many of those things, including the nearly demolition of the hated alternative minimum tax, that phantom tax that came to lurk. You never knew if you would owe it until you'd basically going to file your taxes. That was creeping into middle income Americans. All of those really essential pieces of tax relief go away if Congress doesn't get their act together and the president doesn't sign something by the end of next year. And, looking at the crystal ball in Washington, I think that's a pretty good bet right now that not anything good is going to happen unless we have a different set of characters in the White House and in Congress going forward.
Yeah, Jonathan, typically it's in a president's second term that they really want to enact their more bold agenda. In this instance, Joe Biden going into his second term wants to have a much more progressive agenda. And it's at a time when Americans say that they can afford at least. You wrote in your article on the Daily Caller that 2/3 of Americans say federal income taxes are already too high. Yeah. And as somebody who has a child on the way, my first child on the way, Jonathan, I'll tell you, it is a stretch writing that check 4 times a year. Apparently, I'm not alone.
Well, you're certainly not, and boy, isn't that a scary thought, Austin? If this was the conservative term of Joe Biden, what would a second term look like that's actually progressive? I mean, this is just astronomical. The kind of debt and taxes that have already been racked up on the federal credit card here in the first 4 years. So obviously, his plans for big spending are going to get much worse, and it's going to be, I think, fueled according to his plans by allowing these tax cuts to expire. One of the other elements of this, I think, is really, really important. Is that one of the things that's really underreported around the Trump tax cuts was the doubling of the standard deduction. So now an estimate of about 90% of Americans don't even have to go through and itemize their return anymore. They go through and take that enhanced standard deduction, really making it a much more simplified process. But that's one of those provisions that goes away. So as we just made it through tax filing season, it was brutal for me. I'm sure it was brutal for you, keeping track of all those receipts and records. That's going to be an issue for many more Americans, not just the increased tax burden at a time of high grocery prices, high gas prices, all these insidious effects of hidden taxes of inflation. It's going to be the double whammy of higher tax burdens and a much more complicated federal tax code if Joe Biden gets his way.
Now, you're working with ALEC. You guys have delivered a letter to Capitol Hill. What are you urging Congress to do here?
Well, we delivered a letter with about 350 state legislators' signatures on it, including, I think, 25 from Missouri, saying, enough is enough. We've had a really rough go of it in the last several years, obviously, as an economy trying to come out of this COVID government mandated lockdowns, and then just this huge amounts of $5 trillion or more of government spending being added on, and then all of us being surprised that there's more inflation, right? So getting through this horrible period, the last thing this economy can withstand is this multi-trillion-dollar tax increase. And so our letter essentially says, let's do the right thing for America. Let's do the right thing for hardworking taxpayers all across the country and make these tax cuts permanent. It's a Washington problem that every time we pass a major tax bill, not getting into the kind of crazy details of U.S. Senate rules, but unless you have a super majority, it has to be temporary based on Senate rules. And so this happened with the Bush tax cuts, if you remember. Every substantial tax cut package that we've had has gone through this, and it's really not fair. I mean, people want permanency. They want to make sure that they know that these tax provisions that they've been used to, especially if they're small businesses and they're making investments, maybe they're buying some more of that coffee, right, and keeping that inventory. If they don't have certainty around tax provisions, that really locks up business decision making on the small business side. So this is why ALEC legislators are so motivated. We delivered our first tranche of this letter to Chairman Jason Smith, the great ALEC alum, of course, a Missouri native and a great ALEC legislator when he was there in Jeff City. He delivered it to his office and to our members of Congress. We have about 100 members of the current Congress that are ALEC alumni members. And this work is going to continue throughout the summer. We continue to get huge interest as we travel around the country, more legislators wanting to add their names. So we fully expect by the fall, we'll have a massive letter with state legislators all across the country saying enough is enough. Let's do the right thing here for the American people.
If you're just tuning into the Wake Up America show, good morning. I'm Austin Petersen. We're glad and thankful to have you here. Click that like button. And if you appreciate this message of economic freedom and personal liberty, the follow button as well. So you can come back and join us 5 days a week to hear more great interviews like the one I'm conducting right now with Jonathan Williams from the American Legislative Exchange Council. We're talking a little bit about the Donald Trump tax cuts and the push by ALEC, as they're known, to try and make those tax cuts permanent. Now, I come from the liberty wing of the Republican Party, Jonathan, and people on my side tend to be a bit cranky and sometimes even a bit crotchety, maybe curmudgeonly, if you will. When it comes to a return to the Donald Trump years, they say that he spent a lot of money. Well, that certainly is true, and government spending is a tax increase eventually. But at the end of the day, the people who are paying taxes saw significant drops in the amount of federal taxes that they were paying. Middle income earners saved more than $1,500 annually. That's not peanuts for people who are middle income, Jonathan. Certainly, you can make a living podcasting, but I'm not quite rich yet. Maybe one day I'll hit the heights of fame that I would get if I was a beautiful woman. But as it is, I have to wear silly shirts and be a really good producer in order to build an audience and be able to make the kind of scratch that's necessary to build a family in an economy that's struggling with the kind of inflationary numbers that might actually take Joe Biden out of the White House. So how much do you factor that sort of the angst that people are feeling on one part, inflation, on the other part, paying, the taxes that they might be paying if Joe Biden is reelected? I mean, do you figure that if Joe Biden feels enough pressure from the public in what you're doing right now, that he might actually sign a bill like this? Because there is that, tricky question of even if you got it through something like this through Congress, Joe Biden might not be willing to sign it, although he is very unpopular. So is that kind of the play here, and that he hopes that you hope that Joe Biden is looking at his approval ratings and saying, yeah, I better make these tax cuts permanent because I want to win re-election?
Well, I think it's going to be likely something that's going to play out next year with either, a new administration actually signing this into law and being excited to sign it into law, or we're going to continue to build educational awareness for Americans to say this is coming and you need to make sure that you're aware of it, because a lot of folks in Congress don't want you to know right now that those massive tax cuts are going to go away. And so it's really building this awareness as an educational campaign to the grassroots and to grass tops. State legislators across America are busy balancing their own budgets, right? I mean, it's something that 49 out of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements. And it's just a foreign concept to say, why doesn't Washington get that spending problem under check? I mean, that's a very good point that you bring up, in that, yes, this has been a bipartisan problem of overspending in Washington that has led this scourge that we have with the hidden tax of inflation. And so I think the new administration, whoever it may be, needs to really focus on two things if we want to look at turning this American economy around. Is that, yes, we need to put the stops on overspending. That's easier said than done. I mean, it's done at the state level, and there's lots of great ways that we can point to, such as spending limits, my personal favorite is Colorado's Taxpayers Bill of Rights. That just in the Constitution says you can't grow government or tax rates or burdens faster than population and inflation. Basically, the size of the economic pie as it's growing. Don't let government grow faster than it. Kind of common sense economics 101 right there from the states. But the other thing that we need to do, Austin, and this is why the tax cuts and making those permanent are so important, is we need real growth in America again, because those anemic jobs numbers that we've been seeing, the anemic GDP numbers that we've been seeing, that last quarter, it was 1.6% economic growth in the last quarter, and then it was revised downwards, you remember, to 1.3. I mean, this is not the kind of growth that's going to get anybody out of this debt problem or the spending problem. And if we get to back towards a 3% economic growth scenario that we did see through many of those quarters of the Trump administration after those tax cuts, that's the kind of thing that covers really a multitude of sins when it comes to spending. Let's all hope we can get spending in check, because we absolutely need to get spending in check, because spending equals taxation, as you correctly point out. But we also need economic growth. And unless we renew these tax cuts, we're not going to get to a 3% economic growth scenario.
Well, Jonathan, what about the Senate or the upper chamber? I mean, how is it looking in terms of convincing the upper chamber to jump onto this proposal as well?
Well, I actually think that there may be a pathway there, because you do have, a nearly tied chamber at this point. You have some eccentric characters, to say the least, on both sides of the aisle. But I mean, you do have those that are up for reelection in tight races right now, like Tester in Montana and others that are coming from very conservative states, that if you put a tax cut, in front of them to say, hey, this is an up or down vote right now, I think a lot of them are going to have to think very difficultly around, you actually want to vote against a common sense tax cut for middle class America, right? I mean, as much as Nancy Pelosi in her press release said this was a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires, Austin, as we know, as how it's played out, those Trump tax cuts were very good for the middle class. They were very good for those with families and with children. And this is something that I think everybody, as they're thinking about the fall, is going to be very hesitant to vote against a tax cut package. Now, the big question, of course, would Chuck Schumer ever allow it to come to a vote? And I think the answer to that is pessimistically no, he's not going to, because he wants to protect those vulnerable members. Because if it did come up for up or down vote, I think you may have a majority even right now out of the United States Senate.
Jonathan, is there anything else on this topic that we might have missed that we should cover, or perhaps something that you'd like to share with our audience before we let you go today?
Well, it's one of the things that in 2017, as I was working on this, Chairman Kevin Brady from Texas, who was chairing Ways and Means and started this whole process, invited me to testify and provide our ALEC research from rich states, poor states, and what we were finding and what works at the state level. And of course, that's a big element here, is we know this just tax cut revolution that's happened. Lots of 5 states have become flat tax states in the last couple of legislative sessions. We're seeing huge gains for pro-taxpayer policy, and there's a disconnect, folks. And this is a big problem, as we're moving the needle when it comes to freedom and liberty at the state level. Washington is resistant, and that's why I think the voice of state legislators is so important here. And one element starting in 2017 that didn't get a whole lot of press out of the Washington and New York press corps, but it was so important of the tax cuts, was the limit on the so-called state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction that was in the federal tax code, that basically allowed wealthy taxpayers in the big high tax states to write off those high taxes off of their federal returns. And guess what? All of us hardworking taxpayers from lower tax states had to actually subsidize California, New York, and New Jersey with their high spending ways. Previous to the Trump tax cuts, that was an unlimited write-off. The Trump tax cuts limited that to $10,000 annually. And it really did put pressure on those big blue states and high spenders in those states to start to recalibrate and say, well, if we can't write off those tax burdens, maybe we shouldn't be taxing and spending more at the state level. So it was a little bit under the radar. But for those of us that follow federalism and believe strongly in state autonomy and individual liberty and lower taxes, it was a huge element that really set off a wave of tax cutting at the state level that I just talked about. And in some cases, even stopped blue states from raising taxes, because it took away that perverse incentive to actually write it off and have all of us subsidize the high taxes and high spending.
Well, we certainly wish you the best of luck on this, and you have our support. Is there anything that the people who are listening right now can do to help support this effort?
Well, absolutely. And you go to alec.org, check out the letter. And, as you're talking with your state lawmakers, many times you'll see them at the parades. They'll be coming to your doors here in the coming months. Talk to them about this issue to make sure that they've seen the ALEC letter. We'd love to have them on the letter going forward, because having a unified voice of those of us who believe in limited government and more freedom is going to be so important, not just for this battle, but a whole lot of big battles ahead in Washington. And we can use your help with that.
Well, I'll tell you this. I've been in politics quite some time now, 20 years fighting for economic freedom and personal liberty. And for a brief time, I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. I worked for some of those Tea Party institutions, many of whom have collapsed. And there are very few conservative institutions that are still around that are actually effective, not just taking donor dollars and talking a game about limited government, but actually getting the job done. And the American Legislative Exchange Council is one of those institutions. So I definitely recommend that our listeners and viewers find out more about what people like Jonathan Williams are doing at ALEC. Check them out online as well on x.com and visit their website, because they are fighting the fight on the front lines for liberty. Jonathan, thank you very much for your time today. Hope you have a great week, sir.
Well, thank you. Always good to see you.
You as well. That's Jonathan Williams.